The pressure differential across a 6-foot steel sphere is an invisible physical constant, a silent force threatening to atomize its occupants. Inside, the recycled air tastes stale, a minor inconvenience in a controlled environment. A sudden, violent jolt and gravity asserts its dominance. This is the forensic record of a catastrophic system failure, and the precise moment 2 men began a 3-day countdown to asphyxiation, 1,575 feet beneath the surface. August 29, 1973. Roger Chapman, 28 years old, former Royal Navy submariner. Roger Mallinson, 35 years old, engineer. 2 men executing a corporate mandate in the cold Atlantic waters off the southern coast of Ireland. Operating a commercial submersible designated Pisces III, their mission parameters were unremarkable, laying transatlantic telephone cable on the seabed, a procedural operation conducted hundreds of times across similar vessels. The Pisces III was not a vehicle of exploration or scientific inquiry. It was a workhorse, designed for industrial function at depth, nothing more. The submersible itself measured approximately 20 feet in length, its habitable sphere a mere 6 feet in diameter. 2 men, shoulder to shoulder, surrounded by steel, instrumentation, and the muted hum of life support systems. Mallinson had replaced the oxygen tank just prior to the dive, a routine maintenance decision executed without ceremony. That single action, mundane and procedural, would become the difference between a forensic case study and a double fatality. The shift concluded without incident. Standard protocol dictated recovery. A surface vessel, the cable ship John Cabot, began hauling the submersible toward the surface via a steel towline. The ascent was mechanical, predictable. Then the anomaly occurred. The towline snagged the aft sphere hatch, a 6-inch structural component designed to seal the machinery compartment. The hatch cover ripped free. Seawater, approximately 1 to 2 tons, flooded the rear compartment in seconds. The weight distribution became catastrophically imbalanced. The Pisces III pitched backward and began to sink. Not a controlled descent, but a gravitational plummet, 40 miles per hour, stern first, into the abyssal darkness. Chapman and Mallinson, trained in emergency protocols, stuffed cloth into their mouths to prevent severing their tongues on impact. The steel sphere became a ballistic projectile. No power, no control, only the certainty of collision with the seabed below. The impact occurred at 1,575 feet. The submersible struck an underwater gully, landing inverted, half buried in sediment. The external hull absorbed forces sufficient to crush conventional structures, yet the sphere itself held. No cracks, no breaches. The structural integrity of the pressure vessel was maintained. Inside, Chapman and Mallinson were alive, disoriented, and now entombed in a 6-foot capsule at a depth beyond the operational ceiling of most rescue assets. They established telephone contact with the surface. The line, miraculously intact, transmitted their voices upward. They were conscious. They were breathing. But they were trapped in an inverted hull, surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean, with a finite oxygen supply that had just begun its countdown. The immediate aftermath of the collision introduced a profound silence. The chaotic descent, the jarring impact, the adrenaline spike. All of it gave way to stillness. Chapman and Mallinson lay in total darkness. The submersible's power systems were offline, extinguishing all interior lighting. External visibility was irrelevant at this depth. Even with functioning lights, the particulate-heavy water would render vision useless beyond a few feet. They were sealed in a lightless void. Temperature inside the sphere began to drop rapidly. The surrounding water temperature, at 1,575 feet, measured approximately 35 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. The steel hull conducted thermal energy outward with brutal efficiency. Within hours, the interior environment mirrored the external cold. Condensation began forming on every surface, dripping onto their bodies as they lay motionless in the confined space. Mallinson, already weakened by food poisoning contracted prior to the dive, faced a compounded physiological burden. Nausea, dehydration, and the early stages of hypothermia created a hostile internal environment. Chapman, though in better physical condition, understood the arithmetic of their situation. The oxygen tank Mallinson had installed contained a calculated 66 hours of breathable air under normal consumption rates. Normal, however, presumed activity, speech, and movement. Their survival depended on radically reducing metabolic demand. They made a calculated decision: remain as motionless as possible. Silence, no conversation unless operationally critical. Every word spoken consumed oxygen. Every movement accelerated respiration. The telephone line to the surface provided intermittent updates, but those communications were kept terse, clinical. The surface crew needed to know they were alive. Beyond that, every syllable was a liability. The psychological architecture of their confinement began to take shape. Lying in pitch darkness, unable to see each other or their surroundings, the mind begins constructing its own reality. Auditory hallucinations are common in sensory deprivation scenarios. The faint creaking of the hull under differential pressure became magnified. The distant, irregular sounds of deep-sea currents moving sediment created phantom noises that resembled machinery, voices, or structural failure. Carbon dioxide levels inside the sphere began their inexorable climb. The human body exhales approximately 200 milliliters of CO2 per minute at rest. In a sealed environment, that gas accumulates, displacing oxygen and creating a toxic atmospheric ratio. Early symptoms are subtle: mild headache, increased heart rate, slight disorientation. As concentration rises, symptoms escalate: severe headache, dizziness, shortness of breath despite oxygen availability, confusion, and eventually loss of consciousness, followed by cellular starvation and death. Chapman and Mallinson had one advantage: training. Both men understood the physiology of asphyxiation. They knew the timeline, they knew the symptoms, and they knew that panic-elevated heart rate, hyperventilation, would kill them faster than the cold or the CO2. Their survival required absolute discipline. So, they lay still, conserved their breath, and listened to the deep ocean pressing against the hull, waiting for a rescue that might never arrive. 76 hours. That was the initial calculation transmitted to the surface. 66 hours of oxygen in the tank, extended by approximately 10 hours through strict metabolic suppression. Beyond that threshold, the mathematics became lethal. The surface crew understood the timeline. Chapman and Mallinson understood it. The forensic record of deep-sea rescues provided no successful precedent at this depth. The deepest prior recovery had occurred at far shallower parameters, and even those missions carried significant failure rates. Inside the sphere, time became a physiological experience rather than a measured interval. Without light, circadian rhythms collapsed, sleep and wakefulness blurred into a semi-conscious state, punctuated by brief periods of alertness triggered by telephone communications from the surface. The body's natural response to cold shivering was suppressed as much as possible. Shivering burns calories and accelerates oxygen consumption. They could not afford it. Sustenance was minimal: a single cheese sandwich, a can of lemonade. These items, meant as casual provisions during a routine shift, became the entirety of their nutritional intake across nearly 4 days. Hunger, however, was a secondary concern. Thirst was manageable. The primary threat remained atmospheric: the slow poisoning of their own exhalations. The sensation of carbon dioxide toxicity is insidious. Unlike oxygen deprivation, which triggers a desperate panic-driven urge to breathe, CO2 accumulation creates a different kind of distress. The body detects rising CO2 levels and attempts to compensate by increasing respiration rate. But in a sealed environment, increased breathing only accelerates the problem. The urge to breathe deeply becomes overwhelming, yet every deep breath pulls in air with a progressively higher concentration of the very gas causing the distress. It is a feedback loop with a singular terminus: asphyxiation. Mallinson's food poisoning compounded his suffering. Nausea in a confined inverted submersible is not merely discomfort, it is a physiological crisis. Vomiting in the darkness, in freezing temperatures, while attempting to conserve oxygen, represents a profound indignity layered atop the baseline horror of the situation. Yet he endured. Both men endured. The telephone line carried updates from the surface. Rescue assets were being mobilized, ships were converging on their location, submersibles were being deployed. But the depth, 1,575 feet, exceeded the operational range of most available vehicles. The technology required to reach them, attach a lifting mechanism, and haul a multi-ton submersible to the surface without catastrophic failure, was not standard equipment. It required specialized robotics, international cooperation, and an almost impossible coordination of timing and physics. Chapman and Mallinson could do nothing but wait and breathe, and try not to think about the oxygen meter ticking downward, the CO2 concentration climbing upward, and the possibility that rescue might arrive 6 hours too late, or 12, or not at all. The cold settled deeper into their bones. The darkness became absolute, and the arithmetic remained unchanged. 76 hours was the ceiling. Beyond that, the forensic record would shift from rescue to recovery. The international response was unprecedented in both speed and scale. The moment the Pisces III's distress signal was confirmed, a coordinated mobilization began. Ships from multiple nations altered course towards the coordinates off Ireland's southern coast. The United Kingdom, Canada, and the United States contributed assets. The operational challenge was stark: reach a depth of 1,575 feet, locate an inverted submersible half buried in a seabed gully, attach a lifting line to a structure not designed for such recovery, and execute a controlled ascent without snapping the cable or destabilizing the sphere. The primary rescue tool was the United States Navy's Curve 3, a controlled underwater recovery vehicle. Curve 3 was a remotely operated vehicle equipped with manipulator arms, cameras, and the capacity to function at extreme depth. It was not, however, designed for this specific task. Adapting its systems to attach a lifting line to the Pisces III required on-site engineering improvisation under severe time constraints. Every hour spent in preparation was an hour deducted from Chapman and Mallinson's oxygen reserve. The first attempt failed. The Curve 3 descended, located the submersible, and maneuvered into position. The manipulator arms extended, attempting to secure a grappling line to a structural point on the Pisces III's exterior. The connection failed. The line slipped. The Curve 3 was recalled to the surface for reconfiguration. Hours lost. A second attempt was made. The robotic vehicle descended again, navigating the particulate heavy water and limited visibility. The cameras provided grainy, distorted images of the wreck site. The manipulators extended. Another failure. The attachment point was inaccessible, obscured by sediment or misaligned due to the submersible's inverted orientation. The Curve 3 returned to the surface. More hours lost. Frustration mounted among the surface crew. Each failed attempt consumed time that Chapman and Mallinson did not have. The telephone line provided confirmation that both men were still conscious, still breathing, but their voices grew weaker with each communication. The physiological toll of prolonged CO2 exposure was becoming audible. Slower speech, longer pauses. The clinical indicators of impending system failure. A third attempt. Engineers modified the Curve 3's manipulator configuration, adjusted the approach angle, and repositioned the grappling mechanism. The clock continued its countdown. On the seabed, 1,575 feet below, Chapman and Mallinson lay in darkness, listening to the faint mechanical sounds transmitted through the hull as the robotic vehicle maneuvered around their tomb. The manipulator arms extended. The grappling line made contact. The mechanism locked. The connection held. For the first time in 76 hours, a physically secured link existed between the surface and the Pisces III. The Curve 3 disengaged and ascended, leaving the lifting line in place. Now came the most dangerous phase, the ascent itself. The steel cable had to bear the weight of the submersible, plus the residual water in the flooded aft compartment. Any structural flaw in the line, any sudden shift in the submersible's orientation, any unexpected current, any of these variables could sever the connection and doom the rescue. The winch on the cable ship, John Cabot, began its work. Slowly, incrementally, the Pisces III was lifted from the seabed. The ascent rate was agonizingly slow, measured in feet per minute rather than any faster metric. Inside the sphere, Chapman and Mallinson felt the shift in orientation as the submersible began to rise. For the first time in days, gravity worked in their favor, but they were not yet saved. They were simply moving toward the possibility of survival, with an oxygen supply that was now measured in minutes, not hours. The lifting line held. The submersible rose through the water column at a rate dictated not by urgency, but by the structural limits of the cable and the need to prevent destabilization. Too fast, and the hydrodynamic forces could tear the connection point free. Too slow, and the men inside would asphyxiate before reaching the surface. The margin of error was functionally non-existent. Inside the Pisces III, Chapman and Mallinson were aware of the ascent. The change in pressure gradient, though gradual, was perceptible. The creaking of the hull shifted in pitch. The sensation of movement after days of absolute stillness introduced a new cognitive dissonance. Hope is a dangerous variable in survival scenarios. It accelerates heart rate, increases oxygen consumption, and creates psychological vulnerability if the hoped-for outcome fails to materialize. They could not afford hope. They could only afford to continue breathing slowly, shallowly, and wait. The oxygen supply, extended to its absolute limit through near-total metabolic suppression, was now entering its terminal phase. The tank's gauge, if visible in the darkness, would have shown a reading approaching zero. Carbon dioxide concentration inside the sphere had reached levels that would incapacitate most individuals within minutes. Headaches were no longer mild. Dizziness was constant. Cognitive function was degrading. The ability to maintain the discipline required for slow, controlled breathing was eroding under the physiological assault of asphyxiation. The surface breach occurred at 1:17 p.m. on September 1, 1973, 76 hours after the initial descent. The Pisces III broke the waterline, hauled upward by the cable ship's winch. The sphere was visible, battered, encrusted with sediment, but intact. Deck crews swarmed the submersible, securing it to prevent rolling or shifting. The immediate assumption was that the hatch could be opened within minutes, that Chapman and Mallinson would be extracted, that the ordeal was concluded. The hatch was jammed. The external locking mechanism, subjected to extreme pressure differentials and possibly deformed during the impact, would not release. Deck crews applied manual force, no movement. Tools were brought in. Hydraulic pressure was applied. The mechanism resisted. Inside the sphere, Chapman and Mallinson were aware that they had reached the surface. They could hear the activity, the voices, the mechanical sounds of the deck, but they could not open the hatch from within. They were on the surface, surrounded by rescue personnel, and still sealed inside a steel tomb with an oxygen supply, now measured in single-digit minutes. 30 minutes passed. The deck crew worked with increasing desperation, applying cutting tools to the hatch's perimeter, attempting to breach the seal without compromising the sphere's structural integrity or injuring the men inside. The irony was brutal. Survival against impossible odds, a near-miraculous rescue executed across international borders, and extreme depth now jeopardized by a jammed mechanical lock 6 feet away from open air. The hatch finally gave way. The seal broke. The cover was pulled back. Fresh air flooded into the sphere, displacing the toxic CO2-saturated atmosphere that had nearly killed them. Chapman and Mallinson were extracted, physically weakened, hypothermic and suffering from acute carbon dioxide poisoning, but alive. Medical personnel immediately began treatment: oxygen masks, thermal blankets, intravenous fluids. The physiological damage was significant, but reversible. The oxygen tank inside the Pisces III was examined. 12 minutes of breathable air remained. 12 minutes, not 12 hours, not 12 days. 12 minutes separating the deepest successful underwater rescue in history from a double fatality and a very different forensic record. The Pisces III incident was formally designated as the deepest successful underwater rescue in recorded history, a record that remains unbroken. The operational depth of 1,575 feet, the duration of 76 to 84.5 hours, depending on measurement parameters, and the final 12-minute oxygen margin collectively represent the extreme boundary of survivable deep-sea entrapment. Chapman and Mallinson were hospitalized for observation and treatment of hypothermia, carbon dioxide toxicity, and general physiological exhaustion. Both men recovered fully, though the psychological imprint of 76 hours in absolute darkness, freezing temperatures, and the certainty of impending asphyxiation is not a variable easily quantified in medical records. Roger Chapman passed away in 2020. Roger Mallinson remains the sole living witness to the event. The forensic analysis of the incident identified multiple systemic vulnerabilities. The aft hatch cover, a critical structural component, lacked redundant securing mechanisms. The towline recovery procedure did not account for potential snag points on the submersible's exterior. The oxygen supply, though extended beyond its nominal capacity through disciplined rationing, was insufficient for extended entrapment scenarios. These findings informed subsequent submersible design protocols, emphasizing redundant life support systems, improved hatch integrity, and fail-safe recovery mechanisms. In 2023, 50 years after the Pisces III rescue, the Titan submersible imploded during a descent to the Titanic wreck site, killing all 5 occupants. Mallinson, upon learning of the Titan incident, noted the absence of communication as a disturbing indicator. The Pisces III maintained telephone contact throughout the ordeal, providing rescue teams with real-time confirmation of survivability and allowing Chapman and Mallinson to receive updates on rescue progress. The Titan's silence suggested catastrophic failure rather than entrapment, a fundamentally different failure mode with no possibility of rescue. The 12-minute oxygen margin remains the most haunting data point in the forensic record. 12 minutes represents approximately 96 breaths at a resting respiration rate, 96 breaths separating historical rescue from historical tragedy. The Curve 3's third attachment attempt succeeded, where the first 2 failed. Had it required a 4th attempt, the outcome would have been recovery, not rescue. The margin was that narrow. The Pisces III now exists as a case study in the intersection of human endurance, technological limitation, and the unforgiving physics of deep-sea operations. The submersible itself was eventually decommissioned, its operational life concluded by the structural trauma of the 1973 incident. But the forensic lessons endure: the importance of redundant life support, the necessity of robust communication systems, the acknowledgement that at 1,575 feet, surrounded by the Atlantic Ocean, survival is not a guarantee. It is a statistical anomaly sustained by discipline, preparation, and a margin of 12 minutes. Subscribe to Forensic Protocol for the next investigation into the precise moments where human systems intersect with lethal environments, and the narrow margins that separate documented survival from permanent loss.